Okay, let's go back to the screen. Let me talk just a little bit about Aristotle's poetics. Aristotle, the great philosopher of ancient Greeks, wrote a famous work, it's not very long, but a famous work, entitled The Poetics, in which he gives his theory of drama. I mean, I know that, when you see Poetics, you're probably thinking that it's a treatise on poetry, but it's a treatise on drama. But in ancient Greece, as in Elizabethan England, drama was, for the most part, poetic. Hamlet is poetry, right? Wait till you look at it. It's in what is called blank verse, that is to say, unrhymed iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is a line that goes like this: da-da, 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 da-da. Okay? And you can scan the lines in Hamlet, generally speaking, according to that metrical pattern, but without end rhymes, generally speaking. Okay, Aristotle's Poetics was rediscovered in the Renaissance, and as a matter of fact became one of the great texts of the Renaissance as they were attempting to recover the glories of ancient dramatic art in Greece, classical Greece, Rome to some extent. Aristotle said, first of all, that plot is the soul of tragedy. Psyche is the Greek word, our word psyche. Psyche in Greek. So the plot is the psyche, the soul, the spirit of tragedy. Now, what on earth does he mean by that? What he means is that you can have a plot which produces, and let's just say here, broadly speaking, comedy or tragedy. Now, a comic plot is going to present us with a predicament or a series of predicaments. But the characters in the comedy are going ultimately through goodwill, they are going to solve their problem or resolve the difficulty that they have had. Okay? That is what is distinctive about comedy. Whatever problems people have, they are able, with good humor and goodwill and sincerity, they are able to resolve their problems. In tragedy, on the other hand, the opposite happens. Hamlet faces a problem, actually a series of problems, as do other tragic figures. And no matter how good the person is, or how hard the person works, or with what goodwill the person tries to resolve the problem, he can't, or she can't. And ultimately the person is overwhelmed by forces that he or she cannot control. And that's what tragedy is all about. That sometimes there are things that even good people can't handle. That even good people get overwhelmed by. Okay, so as we shall see in Hamlet. But you can think of that in terms of other tragic plots as well. So plotting for Aristotle was really the key to everything else. That's why he says it is the soul of tragedy. But it's likewise the soul of comedy. He just happens to be talking about tragedy here. It is, if we can go back to the screen, what makes poetry more philosophical than history. That's a quote. He says that poetry is more philosophical than history. Well, let's take those terms apart. History for Aristotle in his time was simply the record of events in a chronological sequence. This happened, then that happened, then something else happened. Or at least that's the way Aristotle viewed it. Actually, that's not the way all ancient Greek historians behaved, but that's the way Aristotle saw history. Whereas poetry, and here he doesn't mean just poetry in our sense of poetry, he means imaginative literature generally. Imaginative literature is more philosophical than the simple relating of events in sequence because it demonstrates to us through its plotting the connections among events, the connections among people and the events in their lives. And these are essentially causal connections. So that one thing is causally connected to something else. In a really good plot, which is what Aristotle calls an organic plot. And an organic plot is one in which everything is so connected that you cannot remove any part without disrupting the whole, nor could you rearrange the parts without disrupting the whole. And Aristotle likens the good plot then to an organism. I mean, think about any biological organism. And much of Aristotle's career, by the way, was spent studying biology, especially marine biology. And you look at organisms, and the different parts of the organism work together, right? I mean, you don't just have a stomach. You don't just have a heart. You don't just have lungs and so forth. Those different organs work in relation to one another, or they fail to work in relation to one another. That's how Aristotle saw a play, ideally, at any rate. And so he calls that the organic plot or organic unity. He opposes that to what he calls an episodic plot, one which consists simply of episodes very loosely related to one another. This happened, then that happened, then something else happened, then something else again happened. Okay? And that's why poetry is more philosophical than history. It demonstrates for us, like philosophy, the inner connectedness of things. The plot of tragedy also arouses the emotions of pity and fear, he says. We feel pity for the tragic hero or heroine, and we fear for what is about to happen to them. So we vicariously experience the kinds of emotions that they may be experiencing as represented on the stage or on the screen. This leads to a catastrophe. Notice how many of these words are Greek words. The words we use for drama, how many are derived from Greek? This is why. It's largely through the influence of Aristotle's Poetics. And that finally leads to a catharsis, a purging, a letting go of those emotions, so that we get all worked up emotionally in the tragedy, but then finally there is a catharsis of those emotions. Catharsis also is a term used metaphorically because what is catharsis literally, or what is a cathartic? Yeah, you have an idea?
I thought it was like a release of something.
Yeah, it is release, yeah.
Like a reversal?
Yeah. What else is a catharsis? I mean, what is a cathartic? You ever heard the term cathartic? It's an older term for a laxative. And Aristotle, remember, is very interested in biology. And so he uses that term metaphorically. What we have is a kind of emotional catharsis here. Not a physical, but an emotional catharsis, where our emotions may normally be all kind of blocked up But going to the play becomes a therapeutic experience because we are able to deal with and confront those very emotions that we may otherwise find so painful, maybe even too painful to confront. And now, through the play, we experience a catharsis of those emotions so that when we come out, if you ever come out of a movie and just go, ah, it's like you're exhausted, right? Exhausted emotionally, not just physically, but you're exhausted emotionally by what the play has put you through. That's the kind of thing that Aristotle was talking about. And he says that's good for people. That's good for people. Not all the time, but at least some of the time. So then, see, that's where, just to sum this up, tragedy and comedy can be distinguished. Both begin with a problem for which the characters seek a solution or resolution. In comedy, people of goodwill manage to control events and produce a happy solution or resolution to the problem. And we have that endless fantasy of people being in control of their lives. Wouldn't it be nice if we really, truly were in control of our lives? I mean, sometimes we may be in certain respects, but there are other times when we're not completely in control of our lives. There may be circumstances beyond our control that affect us. In tragedy, even a person of goodwill loses control over events and is drawn to a tragic catastrophe. And that's certainly true in the case of Hamlet. He's basically a good guy. And he's a very sympathetic guy. He's not perfect, but he's basically a good and decent person who loses control over events. And the more he tries to control events, ironically, the more that leads to his losing, finally, control over events. And that leads to his catastrophe. Okay, now, the theory developed at some point along the way in our history of drama that there could be such a thing as a tragic flaw. So you could have basically a good and honorable person who would have some weakness, some lack, or some obsession, and that would be the person's tragic flaw. This was an idea that developed especially in the 19th century. So that each one of us, I mean, like you and me now, each one of us might well have some tragic flaw that might never, ever come out. But in particular circumstances and actions of a particular plot, a flaw that might otherwise never cause a great problem, in this plot might lead to tragedy. Also, in Renaissance drama, there was something called the Machiavellian villain. The Machiavellian villain. Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince. And he said, I'm not going to write a book like other people writing on politics and tell you about the ideal leader and the ideal state. I'm going to tell you what politics is really like. It's dirty stuff, and you have to be dirty to survive. So you can dispense with morality if you need to. The only values for Machiavelli are gaining power and then holding on to power by any means necessary. By any means necessary. So that if you have to kill somebody, you have to kill somebody. You know, if you have people who are opposing you, you have to crush them. You know, it's as simple as that. At the same time, one should seem to be virtuous in public. Just don't think that you have to be virtuous, says Machiavelli. This became a stock character on the Elizabethan stage. And this is the point at which we're going to pick up the discussion